When Burkina Faso's young leader Ibrahim Traoré took the stage and began talking about the idea of a United States of Africa, many in the crowd felt a spark of déjà vu. The dream of African unity is not new. It stretches back to legendary leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Each of them, in their own era, raised the flag of Pan-Africanism. But Traoré's version comes in a time of crisis, a moment when Africa is under immense pressure, economically, militarily, and geopolitically. To understand why this idea matters, we first have to rewind. Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with more than 60% of its population under 25. It is also one of the richest in natural resources: gold, cobalt, lithium, oil, and fertile land. Yet, paradoxically, it is home to some of the poorest nations on Earth. Why? Because for centuries, outsiders, from colonial powers to modern corporations, have extracted wealth, often leaving behind poverty, instability, and dependency. In this context, Traoré's call for unity is not just symbolic, it's revolutionary. He isn't merely saying, let's cooperate. He's talking about creating a superstate, a bloc powerful enough to rival Europe, America, or even China. Imagine Africa with one military command, one economic strategy, one currency, and a single political voice on the global stage. That's what he hints at when he says United States of Africa. But is this dream practical? To answer that, we need to unpack both history and the present moment. Historically, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was born in 1963 with the goal of fostering solidarity and freeing African nations from colonialism. Later in 2002, it evolved into the African Union, AU, which still exists today. The AU speaks of integration, free trade, and peacekeeping, but let's be honest, it's often seen as toothless. It rarely challenges Western powers openly, and internal divisions weaken it. Traoré is not satisfied with slow diplomacy. He represents a new, defiant generation of African leaders who are less willing to play by old rules. In West Africa especially, coups have swept across the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, all rejecting French influence, all looking inward for solutions. When Traoré speaks about unity, he speaks as someone who knows his country cannot face global challenges alone. Burkina Faso is landlocked, poor, and battling insurgencies. But imagine if it were united with neighbors in a powerful federation. Suddenly, the balance of power shifts and the timing is critical. Across Africa, frustration with neo-colonialism is boiling over. The CFA franc currency still ties many African economies to France. Western companies still dominate mining contracts, and foreign troops still patrol African soil under the banner of peacekeeping. For many Africans, this feels like sovereignty in name only. Traoré's words hit a nerve because they give voice to this anger, and they offer a vision of reclaiming dignity. Of course, skeptics immediately raise questions. Is this realistic, or is it just rhetoric? How do you merge 54 countries, each with its own language, culture, borders, and elites who don't want to give up power? Can leaders who are suspicious of each other suddenly work together? These doubts are real. But here's the twist. Every great project in history sounded impossible at first. Think of the United States itself. 13 colonies divided by religion and economy came together after a bloody war. Think of the European Union. Once sworn enemies like France and Germany now share borders without checkpoints. Think of China. A fragmented land of warlords was unified into a single state that today challenges global hegemony. So when Traoré says United States of Africa, the question isn't just, is it possible? The deeper question is, do Africans want it badly enough to fight for it? Part 1 ends here. But this is just the setup. We've seen the vision and the context. In Part 2, we'll dive into how this idea resonates with ordinary Africans, youth, workers, farmers, and how it clashes with the interests of elites and foreign powers. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and spoke about the United States of Africa, the words carried more weight than many observers initially realized. They were not just the fiery rhetoric of a young leader riding on nationalist momentum, they were echoes of a dream that has haunted and inspired the African continent for decades. To understand why Traoré's call resonates so strongly, one must look back at the long history of Pan-Africanism and the repeated attempts to unify a continent often divided by colonial legacies, political rivalries, and economic dependency. Pan-Africanism is not new. It stretches back to the early 20th century, born from the struggles of Africans and the African diaspora against colonialism and racial oppression. Thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey envisioned a united Africa that would reclaim dignity, power, and independence. Later, African leaders themselves, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Sekou Touré of Guinea, and others, brought this dream into mainstream politics. Nkrumah, in particular, spoke passionately about a continental government, famously declaring that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. But as history shows, unity was easier to preach than to achieve. The founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963 marked a milestone, but even then, deep divides emerged between two camps. The Casablanca Group, led by Nkrumah, which wanted immediate political federation, and the Monrovia Group, which preferred a slower approach, emphasizing national sovereignty first. The Monrovia vision prevailed, and the dream of a single African state was shelved in favor of cooperation without true political union. Over time, the OAU transitioned into today's African Union, AU, which, despite its achievements, remains far from the federal model envisioned by Pan-Africanists. Traoré's words, therefore, tapped into a century-old debate. His vision seemed to resurrect the ghost of Nkrumah, reviving the question: can Africa truly unite under one flag, one government, one destiny? For many across the continent, the question is not academic, but urgent. The crises Africa faces today, terrorism, economic dependency, climate shocks, and foreign exploitation, are too vast for any single nation to solve alone. As Traoré sees it, only unity can provide real sovereignty. What makes Traoré's rhetoric striking is his positioning. Unlike older leaders whose calls for unity sometimes felt more symbolic than actionable, Traoré frames Pan-Africanism in the language of survival. For him, unity is not a utopian ideal. It is a necessary shield. He argues that Africa's disunity is precisely what allows external powers to dominate. Whether it is France, the US, Russia, or China, foreign actors have thrived by dealing with Africa piece by piece, exploiting resources and leveraging divisions. A united Africa, Traoré suggests, would not beg for aid or protection. It would negotiate as an equal. Yet, for all the passion behind his words, skeptics point out that rhetoric alone cannot dismantle centuries of entrenched fragmentation. The African Union itself, despite its noble goals, struggles with bureaucracy, lack of enforcement mechanisms, and member states prioritizing their own survival over collective action. Corruption, authoritarianism, and fragile institutions add to the obstacles. Critics wonder, is Traoré repeating the same ambitious slogans that have echoed for generations without producing real results? But here lies the paradox. Though skepticism is valid, the yearning for unity remains strong among ordinary Africans. Across the Sahel, in West Africa, and beyond, many young people express frustration at artificial colonial borders that split ethnic groups, restrict trade, and weaken economies. Social media often lights up with Pan-African hashtags, memes, and slogans. The idea of a United States of Africa carries an emotional pull, particularly for the youth who see unity as a path out of dependency and humiliation. And Traoré, at 36, is uniquely positioned to speak their language. His age, his militancy, and his direct defiance of Western powers give him credibility that older leaders often lack. Interestingly, Traoré's rhetoric also intersects with the growing wave of regional integration efforts. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, launched in 2021, aims to create the world's largest single market. While it is still in its infancy, its existence shows that steps toward integration are already underway. Similarly, regional blocs like ECOWAS in West Africa, the East African Community, and SADC in Southern Africa have experimented, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, with pooling resources and coordinating policies. Traoré's vision, then, does not appear in a vacuum. It aligns with broader structural moves, though he frames it in bolder and more revolutionary terms. For many Pan-African thinkers, the central question is whether unity should come through incremental integration, like strengthening trade, harmonizing policies, and building infrastructure links, or through radical political federation, as Nkrumah once proposed. Traoré's language suggests impatience with slow processes. His fiery speeches call for immediate shifts, rallying against what he views as a neo-colonial trap where Africa's destiny is always delayed. Whether this impatience is practical or reckless is up for debate, but it is undeniably galvanizing. Still, the practical roadblocks remain daunting. Would African states, many of whom guard their sovereignty jealously, willingly dissolve power into a central authority? Would powerful economies like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt accept equal footing with poorer neighbors? Would smaller states trust their survival to a continental parliament or president? These are not minor questions. They strike at the core of Africa's political landscape. And history has shown how fragile attempts at federation can be, from the short-lived Mali Federation to the East African Federation projects. Traoré himself faces constraints. Leading a country battling insurgencies, grappling with poverty, and navigating sanctions, he may not have the resources or stability to spearhead such an ambitious continental agenda. Yet, paradoxically, his very struggles give him legitimacy. He speaks from the battlefield, not from a position of comfort. For some, this makes his vision authentic rather than empty. In this way, Traoré has injected new energy into an old conversation. His challenge to the status quo has forced both leaders and citizens to revisit the dream of a united Africa. Even if his vision does not materialize soon, it rekindles debates about what African independence truly means in the 21st century. Is independence merely about having a flag and a national anthem, or is it about collective power that can resist foreign control and chart a shared future? As Part 2 of our deep dive reveals, Traoré's Pan-African rhetoric is not born in isolation. It is rooted in a long, complex history of unity struggles, failed federations, and enduring aspirations. The idea of a United States of Africa may appear radical, but it sits at the intersection of Africa's past disappointments and its future possibilities. Whether it becomes reality or fades as yet another unfulfilled promise will depend not just on Traoré's speeches, but on the willingness of African states and peoples to move beyond rhetoric into action. When Ibrahim Traoré boldly floated the idea of a United States of Africa, it wasn't merely a domestic slogan designed to ignite nationalist pride in Burkina Faso. It was a carefully crafted signal to the world, a statement that Africa is no longer content with being treated as a geopolitical pawn. But to fully grasp the weight of this vision, one must examine it against the backdrop of global politics, economic dependencies, and the international order, Africa's long history of dependence. Since the end of colonial rule, Africa has been caught in a web of dependence, financial, military, and political. Western nations, through organizations like the IMF and World Bank, have imposed structural adjustment programs that kept many African economies vulnerable. Meanwhile, foreign military presence, such as French forces in the Sahel or U.S. bases in Djibouti, has meant that African sovereignty has always been partially compromised. Traoré's message challenges this legacy. By envisioning a unified Africa, he implicitly calls for a future where African resources are not extracted for external profit, but managed collectively for African people. To his supporters, this is a powerful break from the past. To his critics, however, it sounds like rhetoric, lofty words without an actionable framework. Reactions in the West, unsurprisingly, the West has responded with caution, if not outright suspicion. Western media often frames Traoré as a young, fiery leader whose anti-French stance has destabilized regional cooperation. Washington worries that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger's expulsion of Western forces leaves room for Russian influence. Paris, still reeling from the loss of influence in its former colonies, sees Traoré's United States of Africa rhetoric as a direct assault on French interests in West Africa. But what Western commentators often fail to recognize is that Traoré's rhetoric resonates deeply with African audiences precisely because it is defiant. In an age where Africans see their leaders frequently bending to foreign powers, Traoré's refusal to comply has given him credibility as a leader who dares to articulate African independence in unapologetic terms. The Russia-China factor, of course. The global context is not just about the West. As Western influence wanes, Russia and China are eagerly filling the vacuum. Russia's appeal. Moscow, through Wagner mercenaries and political support, has positioned itself as a friend of African sovereignty. For leaders like Traoré, Russia offers military cooperation without the moral lectures often attached to Western aid. The Kremlin openly champions multipolarity, a vision in which Africa is no longer under the Western umbrella, but is instead free to align with alternative powers. China's strategy. Meanwhile, China plays a longer economic game. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China invests in African infrastructure, railways, ports, and energy systems. Unlike the West, China avoids direct political interference, framing itself as a development partner rather than a colonial overlord. For Traoré's dream of a United States of Africa, Chinese investment could theoretically serve as the backbone of an independent African economy. The irony, however, is that while Traoré rails against dependency on the West, Africa risks falling into new forms of dependency, this time on Russia and China. This dilemma raises a key question. Can Africa ever achieve true independence if its alliances simply shift from one superpower bloc to another? African public opinion, among ordinary Africans, the idea of a United States of Africa has generated excitement, but also skepticism. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, where populations feel abandoned by Western powers in their fight against terrorism, Traoré's words resonate as a promise of dignity and solidarity. Young people, in particular, see him as a symbol of resistance and an embodiment of their frustrations with neocolonialism. In other regions, however, the reaction is more muted. East African nations like Kenya and Tanzania remain focused on regional economic integration through the East African Community rather than a pan-continental project. South Africa, Africa's most industrialized economy, worries about ceding leadership in a continental federation. Nigeria, with its massive population and internal security challenges, hesitates to join in rhetoric that may overextend its commitments. This divide illustrates a fundamental reality. While Traoré's vision is bold, Africa is far from united in how it sees its future. The symbolism versus reality dilemma. The question, therefore, is whether Traoré's United States of Africa is more symbolic than practical. On one hand, symbolism is powerful. In politics, rhetoric often precedes action, just as speeches of independence preceded actual liberation movements. By invoking unity, Traoré may inspire a new generation to demand concrete steps toward continental integration. On the other hand, the realities on the ground are daunting. Economic disparity between African nations remains vast, making a single currency or unified market extremely difficult. Security instability in regions like the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and parts of Central Africa makes collective defense nearly impossible. Governance issues, including corruption and authoritarianism, threaten the trust required for continental unity. In this sense, the United States of Africa functions more as a rhetorical weapon than a near-term policy. It rallies support, shakes the status quo, and positions Traoré as a visionary leader on the global stage. How the world sees Traoré. International community views Traoré through two conflicting lenses: the revolutionary hero, admired by Pan-Africanists, students, and activists who see him as the reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, daring to defy colonial powers. The dangerous populist, dismissed by policymakers who argue that his lack of concrete policies undermines the credibility of his vision. This dual image explains why Traoré has become both one of the most admired and most controversial leaders in Africa today. He is either the continent's bold new voice or a reckless dreamer stirring chaos. The larger geopolitical question. Ultimately, the debate surrounding Traoré's United States of Africa proposal is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's place in the world. For centuries, Africa has been shaped by external powers, colonizers, Cold War superpowers, and global corporations. Today, as the world moves toward multipolarity, Africa faces a choice. Will it remain fragmented and vulnerable to exploitation, or will it find a way to leverage its unity to demand respect on the global stage? Traoré's call may not produce immediate results, but it has already changed the conversation. No longer is African unity dismissed as utopian. Instead, it is being debated, analyzed, and reimagined as part of Africa's future. And in politics, shifting the narrative is often the first step toward shifting reality. When Ibrahim Traoré speaks of a United States of Africa, he is not just repeating a Pan-African slogan of the past. He is reviving a dream that has echoed across the continent for more than half a century. The real question is whether this dream has the strength to move beyond speeches and into tangible reality. For Africa today, unity remains both the greatest promise and the greatest puzzle. To understand where Traoré's vision might lead, one must examine the challenges, the opportunities, and the deeply rooted contradictions facing the continent. The promise of unity in a fragmented world, Africa is home to more than 1.4 billion people spread across 54 countries, speaking over 2,000 languages, and shaped by countless ethnic, cultural, and religious identities. The diversity is stunning, but it has also been the foundation of division. Colonial borders, arbitrary lines drawn by Europeans in the 19th century, created nations that often lumped together communities with little in common while splitting apart others who had lived together for centuries. Traoré's call for a United States of Africa appeals to the desire to transcend those colonial wounds. In theory, unity could transform Africa into a superpower. Imagine a continent that acts with one voice in global politics, controls its own resources, manages a single defense strategy, and uses one common currency. The economic potential alone is staggering: free trade across borders, a market larger than China's, and collective bargaining power against superpowers like the US, EU, and China. This is the dream Traoré is selling, a continent that is no longer a victim of external interference, but rather a co-author of the world order. It's a vision that resonates deeply among the youth, who make up the majority of Africa's population and who are increasingly rejecting old elites tied to France, the West, or corrupt local politics. The harsh reality of sovereignty, yet the obstacles are equally clear. Every African leader, no matter how visionary, faces the same dilemma: national sovereignty. While Pan-African unity is attractive in theory, most leaders are unwilling to surrender real power. Political elites in Africa often rely on state control for their survival, whether it's control of the army, natural resources, or patronage networks. To hand over that power to a continental authority would weaken their grip. This is why, despite decades of rhetoric, Africa remains divided. The African Union, AU, exists, yes, but it operates largely as a symbolic body. Decisions made in Addis Ababa rarely translate into meaningful action. When crises erupt, be it coups in West Africa, wars in Ethiopia, or instability in the Sahel, the AU often issues statements but lacks the enforcement tools to shape outcomes. Traoré's vision confronts this reality head-on. If a United States of Africa is to emerge, who will lead it? Would countries accept a federal government that overrules national parliaments? Would powerful nations like Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt allow themselves to be equal to much smaller states? These are questions that no African leader, including Traoré, has convincingly answered. Economic integration. The make-or-break factor. One of the most important steps toward unity is economic integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, was launched in 2018 with the promise of creating the world's largest single market. If fully implemented, it could boost intra-African trade by more than 50%, reduce reliance on Western markets, and allow African industries to flourish. But progress is slow. Infrastructure remains weak. Roads, railways, and ports that connect countries are underdeveloped. Many nations still rely on exporting raw materials to Europe or China rather than developing industries at home. Tariffs, corruption, and red tape make cross-border trade painfully difficult. For Traoré's vision to succeed, AFCFTA must not just exist on paper, but must function in practice. That means building continental highways, modern rail systems, and digital connectivity. It means standardizing regulations and reducing bureaucracy. Without this, talk of unity will remain hollow. Security, the test of African independence. Another pillar of Traoré's vision is collective security. Africa has suffered from foreign military presence for decades. Whether French troops in the Sahel, American bases in the Horn of Africa, or Russian mercenaries now expanding influence. Traoré argues that a United States of Africa would solve this problem by creating a continental defense system, one African army strong enough to defend against terrorism, coups, and external threats. In theory, this makes sense. Why should Africa rely on foreign powers to secure its own land? But again, the challenge is political. African armies often mistrust one another. Rivalries between states run deep, and many leaders fear that a unified army could one day be used against them. For example, would Uganda allow troops from Nigeria to be stationed on its soil? Would Ghana accept a Malian general commanding African forces? Still, the possibility of a united security framework excites many Africans. The recent wave of coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger has been justified partly on the grounds that Western troops failed to bring peace. Leaders like Traoré now argue that African problems require African solutions, and that only collective security can achieve lasting stability. Cultural and psychological barriers. Unity is not just about politics and economics. It's also about identity. While Pan-Africanism has long inspired intellectuals, ordinary Africans often identify more with their ethnic group, their language, or their religion than with the idea of being African. This is a legacy of both colonialism and local realities. Bringing people together under one flag would require a psychological shift. It would mean creating a shared African narrative through education, media, and culture. It would mean teaching children to think of themselves not just as Nigerians, Burkinabes, or Kenyans, but as Africans first. Traoré understands this, which is why he often invokes history especially the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, to ignite pride in African identity. Is Traoré the face of a new Pan-Africanism? Critics say Traoré is too young, too inexperienced, and too isolated to achieve such a monumental goal. Burkina Faso itself is still battling violence, poverty, and political instability. If Traoré cannot stabilize his own country, how can he unite a continent? Supporters counter that Traoré's very youth is his strength. At just 36 years old, he represents a new generation of African leaders untainted by Cold War politics or decades of corruption. He speaks directly to the aspirations of Africa's massive youth population, which is tired of waiting for promises to be fulfilled. For them, even if the dream of a United States of Africa is far off, it is better to dream boldly than to settle for stagnation, empty rhetoric, or the seed of the future. So, is Traoré's vision empty rhetoric or the beginning of something real? The answer may lie somewhere in between. On one hand, it is unlikely that Africa will form a political federation anytime soon. The divisions are too deep, and the interests of elites too entrenched. But on the other hand, every major transformation begins with rhetoric. Without bold words, there can be no bold actions. When Kwame Nkrumah first spoke of African unity in the 1960s, many dismissed him as unrealistic. Yet, decades later, his ideas still echo. Today, Traoré is taking up that torch. Whether he succeeds or not, he is pushing the conversation forward, inspiring millions and planting seeds that could grow in unexpected ways. Conclusion. The long march toward unity. The dream of a United States of Africa may remain a distant horizon, but Traoré's call has revived hope, forced debates, and challenged Africans to imagine a different future. Even if the continent does not unite politically in the near future, steps toward economic integration, cultural unity, and collective security are possible and perhaps inevitable. In the end, history will judge Traoré not by whether he created a United States of Africa, but by whether he helped Africans believe once again in the possibility of unity. For a continent scarred by division, exploitation, and underdevelopment, that belief alone is a powerful weapon. Traoré's Pan-African vision may not yet be a reality, but it has already achieved one thing. It has reminded the world that Africa is more than just a collection of weak states. It is a continent with the potential to stand tall, speak loudly, and dream big.